Come closer to the fire. Some bridges were built to cross rivers. Others were built to cross time. There's one in Burlington, Vermont. Nothing special by daylight, a wooden span over a narrow inlet. But when the fog rises thick and sound carries sideways, people say you can hear yourself on the other side. Not your echo, not your voice, but a version of you that never left. Tonight's story isn't about ghosts. It's about how memory answers when no one's calling.
This is not my story. It belongs to a retired music teacher named Howard Linton, a man who never learned to walk without measuring rhythm in his steps. He lived 3 blocks from the lake in a single-story house with a small porch and a wind chime that chose its own key. That autumn, fog started arriving early, the kind that cancels color and replaces it with texture. The neighborhood went quiet in the mornings, as if volume knobs had been politely turned down. On the worst days, the church steeple dissolved at the bell, and the waterfront path became a hallway with no walls. Howard kept his routines. He rose before 7, warmed water for tea, checked the barometer by the kitchen window, and tied the same scarf he'd worn since he still taught scales in classrooms. After breakfast, he would take the footpath that hugged the inlet and cross the wooden bridge that arched just enough to make the far end disappear when the mist grew heavy. He liked the sound of his soles on wet planks. The boards answered in low notes, one for each length of timber, and he had learned the pattern years ago, the way some people memorize prayer. The week it began, he noticed a second tone under the footfall. It arrived like a held breath, not loud, not trying to be noticed. He stopped halfway over the water, leaned on the rail, and listened. The tone sat exactly on the pitch he used to test beginners. A clean, open D, no wobble, no vanity. The lake didn't move much. The reeds along the bank made a soft scraping he knew by heart. Yet the note stayed until he stepped again, and then it followed at the same distance, as if the bridge had a slow echo that had only just remembered how to answer. Fog changes proportions. Fences move closer, houses regain their childhood sizes, and time develops a hinge. The next day, the tone returned and brought a thin harmonic with it, something like a second string stirred by sympathy rather than touch. Howard tested the rail with his knuckles, the way he would test a piano with a fingertip from long practice. The wood sent back a polite thump, nothing more. On the town side of the span, the newspaper box looked newly painted. On the lakeside, the rocks gathered at the footings appeared blunter, as if younger hands had placed them. He told himself, air tricks are older than caution, and kept walking. In the afternoons, he sorted music he no longer needed and kept the pages that still taught him something. He had a drawer where letters went to wait. They were addressed to former students, to a brother in Montpelier he hadn't called in years, to a woman he had once promised a trip to Tanglewood and instead given a rain check that never found its calendar. None had stamps. Few had dates. Most ended mid-thought. He read them in the armchair that left a permanent oval in the rug. When he closed the drawer, the wind chime took a single step along the scale and stopped on that same D, an obedient weather vane. He began carrying his tuning fork again. It lived in a felt sleeve, silver blunt at the ends, honest about age. He would tap it against his wrist on the porch and listen for decay time. an old habit from days when room tone decided whether a lesson would be productive. The fork rang as it always had. The neighborhood held it a fraction too long. A name kept returning when he read Clara. She'd been a teenager with a piano that insisted on drifting flat, but a sense of timing that corrected most sins. She left for Boston on a scholarship, promising to visit on breaks, then moved through years, the way some move through doors and never looked back. In the drawer was a letter to her that never reached a stamp. He had written it the week he retired. The lines were neat, the ink dark, the tone too careful. At the bottom, he had added a note he couldn't remember composing. "You still owe me a D major." The morning after he found it, the fog felt newly made. The lake lay without texture, just luminance. The floating dock further downshore had no edges until a gull landed and carved a brief geometry from the gray. He struck the tuning fork at the middle of the span. The bridge replied, not with the metallic twang wood sometimes pretends to, but with a tone that matched and then stabilized, as if it had been waiting for permission. He moved the fork closer to the rail, and the sound grew quietly sure. He stood there long enough that joggers became silhouettes that hesitated and reconsidered their routes. He folded the letter into his coat pocket, a neat rectangle where the paper could learn the shape of his body. The air on the far end of the bridge looked brighter, or simply less certain about being opaque. He decided to come earlier the next day to find out whether dawn respected ordinary agreements. Before sunrise, Burlington belongs to delivery trucks and one dog per block. Howard left before they started, moving carefully to avoid slipping on leaves that the fog had turned into small rumors of ice. The bridge emerged from the path slowly, a rib against the pale. He placed his palm on the first post and felt water living inside the grain. The gulls had not yet committed to mourning. A buoy bell on the outer channel sounded as if it came from underfoot, rather than out on the lake. He reached the middle and waited. The tuning fork felt cool and smooth against the skin. He tapped it, and its clean pitch stood in the air. The reply came faster this time and layered itself, not thicker, just more certain, as when two instruments agree in a room without asking who leads. He advanced one plank, and the sound drew forward as if it had been tied to his ankle invisibly. He advanced another, and it followed. The mist around the far rail lost its insistence. He could see the shape of the last post, and then the color of the paint. Not this year's white, but the enamel from years when budgets were more hopeful. Light changed without brightening. He describes it himself in his lesson notes written later. The air thinned, the boards became dry beneath the foot, and the far shore stepped nearer. He did not claim a vision. He wrote that he recognized the slope of the path when the bridge had been newly planked and the railings still smelled of sap. He wrote that sound moved differently, not faster, just less tired. He writes that he didn't step through anything. He just kept walking, and the world decided to be earlier. On the far side, he stood in a day that had been folded and kept. The houses looked the same but unwrinkled, the mailbox paint more certain, the maple leaves a tone brighter before the season learned restraint. He heard piano practice from a window that had not hosted music in years. The rhythm belonged to scales he had assigned 2 decades earlier, and the pauses had the same shapes a particular student had once carved into them. He followed the path, not far, only to the corner where he could see across the inlet back to the bridge. He saw a figure crossing toward him. He knew the posture immediately because he had carried it. The man put his hand on the rail with a familiarity that said tenure rather than trespass. Beside him stood a teenager with a case, hair pulled back, expression set to solve problems more interesting than adult conversation. He could not hear words. He insists he didn't try. He watched the way the hands moved in air while describing how to settle a shoulder, how to let a bow settle before it speaks. He watched the girl nod and adjust, and he watched them stand side by side as the first note sounded. He doesn't use the word ghost. He writes like a teacher. The tone was centered, the intonation reliable, the dynamic honest to the room, the decay unhurried. He felt the bridge answer, not loudly, not theatrically, but with confidence, and the water received the sound like a page that knows where the margins belong. He blinked. A gust came off the lake, carrying the smell of rain and last week's firewood. The scene thinned as if distance had a hand on it. He stood at the far rail alone, and the boards regained the damp under his shoes. When two tourists reached the middle later that morning, they found a folded letter tucked between planks where the rail meets the post. The paper was dry in a damp world, the ink not quite fresh and not quite old. The city maintenance crew collected it, and because small towns still carry habits of neighborliness, delivered it to the address on the envelope. The house was locked at the knob, but not at the deadbolt. On his kitchen table, a kettle sat without steam, and the clock above the stove had stopped in an honest way, hands pointing where they would for a while. For several days, nobody asked loudly where he was. Retirees can take long walks if nobody deserves a schedule. Then the postal worker noticed he hadn't picked up 3 days' worth of ordinary obligations. Neighbors agreed to check. The coat hung where it always did, the felt sleeve on its hook, the tuning fork gone. In the drawer, the letters had been rearranged as if somebody had asked them for assistance. On the piano, he no longer tuned, stood a sheet of lined paper bearing a single staff. On it, D major had been mapped carefully with pencil, all the notes in their places, no ornaments, just the scale itself, a method drawn into a square. That evening, the fog rolled off the lake again briefly, a last exhale before the weather dried into a more conventional October. Several people said they heard a tone while crossing after sunset. It was not loud. It behaved with that particular courtesy sound acquires when it knows you might ignore it. It seemed to come from behind rather than ahead, and it did not change when people tried to match it with their voices. Some stopped walking and listened. They all remember that the note did not waver. Years later, Clara returned to Burlington for reasons that made sense only to paperwork. She did not stay long. She left flowers on the bridge rail, not out of grief, but because the place looked like it made room for small proofs. She told a friend she kept hearing one pitch everywhere that week, not in music, just in the mechanics of town life. The refrigerator settling, the radiator waking, the elevator deciding, the crosswalk's metal throat when it clicked. She thought of looking up Howard and then remembered he wouldn't be there to be found. On the morning she left, there was a letter on her piano in Boston. The envelope had traveled more than most envelopes should. The message inside was short and practical. You still owe me a D major. No signature, no date. The kind of instruction that doesn't require explanation. I visited the bridge the following winter on a gray afternoon when the lake behaved like stone and the wind cut at an angle that makes eyes water without permission. The boards had been replaced since the year of the fog. The city keeps up with its responsibilities. I stood at the midway post and did what everyone does there now. I listened. Car tires on the distant road made their usual cloth-tearing sound. A pair of skaters claimed a cove and made soft mistakes. The gulls argued without urgency. Under it all, quiet enough to doubt and steady enough to accept, a pitch held. It did not ask to be named. It sat where it needed to and asked me only to notice. Not all places tolerate that kind of attention. This one did. The bridge didn't promise anything. It simply kept faith with a function the map hadn't included. On my way back across, the boards produced their familiar notes, each plank telling me where I was without flattery. The far shore returned me to errands and a grocery list, and the sense that the week would come whether or not I believed in it. The sound stayed behind me at the same distance, a companion that refused to crowd.
Most bridges teach you forward. A few teach you back. If you ever find yourself on that Burlington span when the fog peels the world down to shape and sound, take the middle slowly. Do not call out. Let the note appear on its own time, then cross as if you remember how. Yesterday is not a door. It's a tone that waits exactly where you last stood still.